All right. Welcome
Okay,
to the show. I feel like a podcast host.
I
Here we
love it. I'm really into podcasts,
go.
so this
Great.
is
Well,
a
this is
privilege.
the History of the Middle East podcast. Welcome to the show. I am so happy to be having this conversation with you, and I wish that you could come in person and meet my students, or that we could come visit you. But this is the next best
Me
thing.
too.
Thank you.
Yes, me too.
So let
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's really a pleasure. Let's start with if you could just briefly, introduce, your name, and that's about it. So, if you just want to,
Okay.
where you
So,
are, what you're doing.
so my name is Chama Mechtaly. I'm sure you've introduced your students to a bit of my work, so I won't bore them with that. But I am right now in the marina in Dubai, and just been a really busy day, working on a lot of things with a holiday pop up coming up this weekend. Preparing for that, I've also been helping out with some delegations that came from Israel this week and the last week. So I've been really navigating like the political delegation, the cultural,
Mhm.
the economic business one. So it's been a little crazy.
Wow. Well, we appreciate you making the time, and we definitely want to talk about all
Of
that.
course.
Let's start
Yes.
with, the kind of the big picture. You're living in Dubai, you're living in the Gulf. You grew up in Morocco. So,
Mm.
do you feel like it's all the Middle East? Do you feel like there's a big difference between living in North Africa and living in the Gulf? Like,
Yeah.
how does the region feel different to you or hold together?
Yeah, I would say it's so different. I mean, there are some things that are familiar to me by virtue of the fact that I speak classical Arabic. I grew up exposed to Arabic music, to music from the Gulf, obviously, but also from Egypt, which has been quite hegemonic in the region and that people from all over can relate to, as it was used to kind of also push this idea of Arab nationalism. So yes, there are things I relate to, but there are also things that are extremely foreign to me and that I think are very misunderstood about Moroccans and North Africans in the region. And so, as an intersectional woman of Moroccan nationality, I think I'm presented with a lot of challenges that other women in the region coming in here don't really experience. And we can definitely get into that. But also just on the basics of people assuming that I speak the same kind of Arabic coming from Morocco just because this is, the Arab region or the Arabic speaking region, or that I might identify the same way that someone from the UAE or Saudi would identify. And so just kind of being hit with those assumptions and stereotypes on a daily basis is quite interesting to navigate. And I think because there's so little, very, very little representation of North African culture and the complexity of identities and history of North Africa over here, then there's very little space for understanding and dialogue. So even when it's so basic. So even when it boils down to like your name, so I say that my name is Shama, and here, that's foreign to them. They're more used to Shemma. So I'll try and say, my name is not Shemma, it's Shama. But because they haven't been exposed to that, even though it is an Arabic name from old archaic Arabic and poetry from Al Jahiliyyah and all of that, but they've lost this reference. And so they keep kind of trying to frame my name as something they understand and they can relate to. And so, yes, there are lots of challenges. And I think women in the Maghreb region have had a very different history and have had a different relationship with the state and with politics and being really involved in social policy and in the destiny of their communities. And we've had a very strong history of feminist scholarship and of political participation. And so when we come here, we are sort of seen as somewhat kind of Arab looking. And so there are certain expectations and stereotypes that are linked to us. And so when we start having conversations and interacting with people, and especially in intimate kind of relationships and getting to know people, we exist outside of their understanding of how women should believe. So there's a clear kind of cultural and social divide in terms of the expectations of how women should show up in the public and private spaces and within relationships. And I think that's where a lot of trouble is created. And that's also why a lot of Maghrebi women in the region actually end up getting abused and going through very rough experiences in this region.
Terrible. Well, I
Yeah,
definitely want to talk about sort of uh, more about women and feminism, but before we get there, I want to stay a little bit with the zoom out picture for a moment and ask about
amazing.
where the United States fits into this. We're here in the United States. I know you've spent some time living in the United States, of course. What is the role of the United States in the relationship it has right now? Of course, we're seeing the headlines. There's an arms deal. There's the new administration, Israel, America. How do these players affect what the politics are happening on the ground there?
So let me just start by saying that I feel very American, even though I'm not, but but I do have an intimate relationship with the United States. My siblings live there and my siblings are American and my nephews are American, and I relate and reference American culture all the time. And so I do feel like I have like one foot in each side of this dynamic. Now, with the Trump administration and with what's going on recently between the UAE and Israel and other countries in the region, as you know, Morocco officialized their diplomatic and political relationship with Israel as of a few days ago. And it is the fourth country in the region to do so. And so yes, the dynamics are shifting, and obviously, as we know, this is happening quite rapidly before Trump gets that leaves the White House. I will remain diplomatic. Before Trump leaves the White House, they're trying to kind of accelerate these things, and so, yeah, there's so much that's kind of showing up in my head. I just don't know in which direction to take it. But obviously, the dynamics of the region are changing. It is a new reality. It does present a lot of hope, but also tremendous challenges, because I personally, as someone who's lived and worked in these kind of interfaith spaces for 10 years and who's been representing minorities in the region for over 12 years through my visual arts and activism, for me, it's crucial to do more cultural relationship building between the Jews and the Palestinians, between Israelis, Palestinians, Jews and Arabs, between Emiratis and Israelis, between Moroccans and Israelis, because we've lived in a region that has been completely polarized for over 70 years, and with so much propaganda on both sides. So it's very difficult to say, okay, we will officialize relationships and we'll have business together, and then people will just magically fall in love and magically start to like each other, when the only reference they've had of each other is that of an enemy, and that's the only way they've been seeing each other. So that kind of reconciliation that's meaningful and long-term and sustainable, that hopefully we're aiming for, will take time and will require a lot of investment in terms of cultural projects, academic conferences. We're hoping to bring here a conference that brings together scholars from the Jewish and Muslim diaspora from North Africa and the Middle East, who is working on these questions of interfaith and the shared heritage between the Jews and the Muslims in the region. and has been kind of promoting new scholarship on these topics. So hopefully we can make these things happen, and get the right support for them, because when it comes to activism in the region, unfortunately, it can't just grow organically. It requires governmental support and a governmental push. And
Mm.
so hopefully, because there is a push for um, these new kind of business and political relationships, there will also be support for meaningful cultural projects and social and academic exchange programs and cultural programs in those lines. Um, so that's a bit about the micro picture as it relates to the UAE and Israel, and the new dynamics we're witnessing. Also, there is also some skepticism because the new administration is going to come in January, and so there are some questions that I hear voiced from both the Israeli and the Emirati sides, on whether these peace deals will be supported by the new administration and what kind of impact they can have on sustaining these efforts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really similar to some of the questions we had when we were talking through this in class, last week about,
Yeah.
we, are these, what are the motivations? There are so many different players. It seems like, what are the advantages of, different parties who are involved? What are they expecting to gain financially? Are there business opportunities? Are there, increased trade? There's a lot of trade in weapons. We've been hearing about, arms deals, fighter planes, all kinds of advanced military technology. So that obviously has some advantages for some people, who are selling the weapons, but
Right.
that creates, for many of us, we were thinking, well, that feels like, if that's the only, um if that's the only basis for this relationship, is trading these weapons of destruction, that's not
Right.
really going to lead to a positive impact on people's lives in the region necessarily. And what, so then, is there going to be an increase in, uh, building the relationships that you were just talking about, cultural exchange,
Yeah.
social, I mean, if that's coming along with that, then that's going to be great. If it's just fighter jets,
Yeah.
I think there's going to be some
Exa-
danger.
exactly. And even, when you talk about having an economic relationship, those things won't last, because if you're just supplying arms and signing contracts and there's no meaningful relationship building that's happening between these communities, then it's one day someone says something, you know, and another person is upset and these things fall apart. That's the kind of scenario we don't want to see. And as someone who's worked and studied conflict resolution,
Mhm.
I I don't believe in arms and weapons, and I don't believe in hyper masculinity and aggression, and I don't think that those things bring any long term benefits to societies. But I have to say that, as also someone who studied international relations, every country has the right to defend itself, and they have the right to do it to do it in ways that are ethical, of course, and legal. And so, as long as that's the case, I'm not raising any concerns. But it is really crucial and important to make sure that we have organizations, associations, networks, communities that are born almost kind of organically between Israelis and Emiratis, or Israelis and Moroccans, to make sure that these kind of plans, really grand plans for peace, knowing the context of the region, are more sustainable and realistic as well. And so that we can start to kind of undo the deep, deep damages and traumas of the last 80 years. And so that's going to be really crucial. Developing these meaningful and strong networks where people can sit together and humanize each other, listen to each other, and validate each other's traumas. I think that's the main challenge here, is that, and in the US, is that, you know, different people from different parties and different political agendas do not hear each other. And we're obviously looking up to the US to see what kind of tools will be developed in this new environment of extreme segregation.
Yeah, yeah. I wish I, I wish I had answers or even confidence that they're like, oh yeah, we're gonna find them. Well, I that's actually a good segue into kind of the another set of questions that a lot of us, a lot of the students in our class were wondering about some of the similarities and differences in terms of social issues that we see around us here in the States, and you know, what's happening in the Middle East. We're going to talk about feminism when in a little bit, but what other kinds of you know, what other kinds of changes do you feel like you're fighting for in society? For example, here in the U.S., as you know, there are major issues with
Yeah.
racial segregation, with anti-Black racism. How does that show up in the Arab world, with the different constellation of races and ethnicities?
Yeah.
What are you doing? I know
And
it's
gender
and gender,
and
of course.
feminism.
Yeah.
Yeah,
How does that all relate?
absolutely. There are similar issues here. It's just that they're not as talked about. They're not as tense um, because it's a very different history, of course. And it's not that we haven't had slavery in the region. That would be a lie, massive misrepresentation. But it's just that we've had very kind of different dynamics show up socially. And the fact of the matter is that Black minorities are still extremely marginalized in the region and have not ascended to attaining political power on the basis of their difference in terms of skin color. And so because of that, you don't see the type of organization that we've seen in the US. But that doesn't mean that the issues do not exist. Now, it's really interesting too, because once you start to have these conversations with the general public, because there's such denial about the presence of these issues, they really struggle to receive. They really struggle to engage on these topics and say, well, no, we don't. We have socioeconomic disparity, but we don't have racial injustice. And they fail to see how these two things often interconnect and interlace, right? And so I'm glad you brought up the kind of recent wave of the racial injustice protests that have been kind of sweeping the US this year. And so that has had some kind of reverberations and some echo in the region that was quite unprecedented. I think the fact that it was in the middle of a pandemic and people were starting to notice how even the coronavirus was affecting minorities and Black people, Indigenous people in America and in other places all over the world a lot more, and significantly more. And in an environment where people already feel oppressed because they're trapped at home in a lockdown and governments became a lot more authoritarian kind of overnight because of the public health requirements. Then you had people who already started to feel what the experience of oppression is like. And so in a way, it facilitated the empathy and the compassion. And I think that was really crucial. And so we started seeing these different organizations and like Instagram groups and social media groups who were mobilizing their communities and raising awareness and consciousness in terms of Black rights, not just in America, but also in the region. I myself facilitated a series of discussions and workshops on the topic of anti-Blackness in the Arabic-speaking world over the summer in June and July. And it was really interesting because we had people from the entire region who, logged into Zoom meetings just like these, and really like had a lot of questions. So there's clearly an appetite. There is a need, and I think in a way, this is the blessing of the pandemic, is that everyone can now access Zoom meetings and host kind of these academic discussions, which we were lacking severely in this region. And we were connecting with people from across borders and really engaging in these discussions, and then the challenges and trying to map solutions going forward. And so we even had someone from the Emirati consulate in London who was really, really interested in understanding the history of slavery in the region and colorism issues in the region and how they affect Black women specifically, and how they affect transgender women in the region. And so she started thinking, okay, we're going to have to implement some projects and do some events on these issues in London and in the UAE. And I think that's the hope for these kind of consciousness raising meetings and workshops, is to have people on the policy level get together and say, okay, well, clearly we haven't been doing things properly. So what can we do? What can we change? How can we progress? How can we develop? And how can we be more inclusive? And I think it's even a friend of mine I had a discussion with recently about minorities in art institutions, and she's the head of museums. And so she in one of the Emirates here, and she was saying, well, it's also about letting people in big management positions who are representative of minority statuses, so that the change can happen more organically, because it's much easier for those people to understand the problems and understand the challenges that are affecting minorities, and to pulling other minority groups and communities and artists, because they have those networks. That's where they live, and that's who they connect with, right? And so it has been having a really positive impact on the region.
Wow, that's amazing. I think I want to ask then, what for those of us here, in in the States, how can we learn about and support those kinds of efforts without repeating the kind of paternalistic or patronizing superiority kind of like work colonial mindset? I think a lot of the last few our course we've been talking about, on the one hand, we want to support and uplift these kinds of transformative efforts that are happening. We want to do it from a genuine place of allyship, and not from the colonial mindset of coming in to save oppressed people from themselves, right? So
Yeah.
how do we balance that?
So, I mean, I have to say we have to kind of deconstruct that question first, because when you say how do we, who's the we? Like, is it citizens of the United States? And that's like extremely difficult, because your country is really divided and segregated, and people have different ideologies.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about supporting the Middle East, like who is supporting the Middle East? Who is supporting North Africa? And what kind of ideology do they have? And what do they want to enforce? That's where things get really tricky. But when you're saying the students of the University of Minnesota want to support these initiatives, great, let's do it. Let's have more discussions. Let's build more meaningful conferences and events and cultural exchange programs and things like that. But it's tough because, well, first of all, you guys haven't resolved the issues at home, right? So and so it becomes really difficult to say, I'm going to go to a country and fix up their issues. You can't fix someone or something when you're broken inside, when you haven't fixed your own issues, right? You don't have the energy, the tools, the capacity to do that. So that's part of the challenge. And obviously there are so many other things. When we talk about aid and intervention and supporting other countries, there's so many ideologies and economic interests that we have to talk about, and they're intersecting issues that stand in front of and as an obstacle to the successful implementation of these supportive measures. And I think part of it is because the people in charge usually of these massive organizations that aim to intervene, support, and aid come from extreme privilege, are usually white men who come from, very strong families, very big family names, who don't understand what it's like to be suffering, to have been oppressed, to flee your home because of violence, to sit at the intersection of gender discrimination, race discrimination, religious oppression, and for these people to then try and implement something, they will obviously miss some of the basic things that really define the experience of a minority person.
Yeah.
So that's part of it.
It's a tall order, but I think it's a great charge. That brings us.
And just if I may, so really just to summarize it, if you want to help the region and help these initiatives get more diversity in your sort of management positions, in your boards, in these organizations that aim to help, so that they can be more representative, more inclusive, and more successful.
Yeah, I think that's a huge point. Let's zoom in specifically to talking about feminism, because I think that's one of the social issues that is not only so central to everything, but also just judging from the volume of questions we received, it's something that for my students is really foremost in their minds, thinking about all of the different similarities and differences and complexities and nuances of gender between the United States and the Middle East. So maybe we can start by just saying, what do you see as the primary goals of feminism or fighting for women's rights in your work? What are the challenges that you're facing?
Yeah. There's so many, I would say, but I think at the core of it is that we are still living within systems that police women's bodies all over the world. And in this region, that becomes even more complicated because of the social contract and the social norms that women have had kind of imposed on them.
Yeah.
Right. And so on the one hand, there is so much room for legal reform in terms of how women are allowed certain rights and restricted from so many others. But also in terms of what women can or cannot do, even within the family and within like the public and private spaces. And very often these things are not really even talked about. We don't even have the language sometimes to talk about these things. And the lack of language is really kind of partly due to this kind of post-colonial legacy that we're still dealing with. Because very often in our dialects, our mother tongues, we don't have like technical language to describe certain experiences. And when you don't have a word,
like
you can't, yeah. And when you don't have a word, you can't talk about the experience. Right. You can't really
name it,
define it, name it, exactly. And so it's almost like, oh, then this experience doesn't exist. It's very easy to dismiss it. And so I think part of doing this kind of feminist work means decolonizing, means looking through language and reclaiming old words and rituals and practices that our great grandmothers and ancestors used to describe our experience. And even when it comes to sexuality, I can't even begin to tell you, I cannot talk about sexuality in my mother tongue. Like, it's not even, you know what I mean? It's not even comprehensible for me to think, because sexuality has become completely taboo, and the language used is therefore vulgar. So if you're a woman from a good community and a good family, you cannot use those words. And we don't know the alternative. What is, what can I use that isn't demeaning, that isn't vulgar, that is acceptable? And that's really crucial, because if you can't use your mother tongue to talk about sexuality, that means that you cannot be sexual, and you cannot be sensual, and you cannot live with your body. Like, you cannot actually accept your body and accept your desires and your needs. So that's a whole other issue. But yes, I think there are some severe challenges that also still stand, legally speaking. And we'll get into more details of these with more questions.
Yeah, I just want to highlight something you said, which I think is so interesting, especially for my students. We're in a history course, and I think what you just pointed to, if I understand you right, is that studying history actually becomes a resource for rebuilding and reshaping ways of living and being in the present and future, that we can recover terminology or experiences or ways of organization from the past that actually can point to alternative paths forward. I think that's a huge insight for those of us who are studying history professionally or as students.
Right.
Sexuality is such an interesting example. There are so many fascinating works, of classical Arabic, from the Middle Ages, there's poetry, there are manuals, there are literary, there's so much about sexuality in Arabic, in medieval literature.
And through different genders, right? Not just heterosexual.
Different configurations.
Yeah.
It would be, to say, okay, let's go back to that heritage. Let's investigate the fullness and the complexity of that heritage, and then see, are there things that we can reclaim in the present that will open up new possibilities? That is such a great tagline for why it's important to study history. So I just want to.
It's so crucial. So crucial. And think about how colonialism actually criminalized homosexuality in a lot of these contexts. And this is such an urgent matter, because in this year, when a lot of social issues have been magnified, think of Sarah Hijazi, the late Sarah Hijazi, who showed the flag at a Mashru' Layla concert in Cairo, and was basically put in prison for 3 months and inherited so much PTSD that even when she fled to Canada as a refugee, even years later, she was still dealing with the trauma and the pain from that, and the fact that she was never accepted in this world and never seen. When you look at your history, when we reflect on our history, there is so much richness when it comes to discussing and reflecting on the experience of queer communities within this region. So obviously, in our society, these people don't feel seen, because there is no representation, there's no decolonization, there's no reclaiming of these stories. And obviously people end up feeling really desperate or suicidal or grieving and in pain because we exclude them. And there's nothing more dangerous than excluding people. Nothing more dangerous.
And again, I just want to highlight for to connect to something that we've talked about a lot in our course, is that this brings us back to the challenge of decolonization, because colonialism in all kinds of different ways, in legal ways, in cultural ways, imposed these barriers or divisions or obscured realities that people are still, decades, and even in some cases, like 100 years, close to 100 years later, are trying to remove and detangle. It's true of, I mean, we've talked about in our course a lot about um, interfaith and intercultural relations, right? That it was actually colonialism in many places that
Mm,
put a wedge between, let's say, Jewish and Muslim communities by creating
absolutely.
separate educational
Just
systems,
separate.
separate
Yeah.
neighborhoods, and separate ways of, government positions that were available to some groups but not others, you know,
Mm.
and
And
economic interests of the oil industry
right,
came in and elevated certain groups against others,
right.
and
Absolutely.
promoted those divisions.
And given even privileges like citizenship in the
Right,
case of Algeria to the
right,
Jews
exactly, right.
and excluding the Muslims. Yeah.
So those divisions. So then, even in the post-colonial period, yes, technically the colonial government structures are gone, but all of those divisions and areas of conflict are still there. So that's the legacy. That's like the really difficult and painful legacy that
Yes, absolutely.
we're still wrestling with.
Oh my God. And that reminds me of something too. And this is why I appreciate these kind of conversations with people like you, because you're able to create more links and more connections in your brain. And one story that I grew up with when I was trying to kind of compare the experience of my father,
Mhm.
having grown up in technically a Jewish neighborhood in Casablanca
Mhm.
with so much diversity, and my mother who grew up in Tangier,
Mhm.
and only kind of seeing Jews with a very, very narrow lens. And she, when I started kind of doing that decolonization work with her, she told me, well, look, I didn't know many Jews, and the Jews I knew were the Jewish kids who went to schools sponsored by l'Alliance Israélite Universelle, right? So this is a French organization with global outreach
Right.
that was financially supporting certain institutions in Morocco and other places who would take in Jewish kids. And so what she noticed was that these kids had better clothes, were better fed, they had a very kind of systematic structure to their education. They would take, lunch break and had their little like lunch packed and all these things. And so what she noticed about the Jew was a socioeconomic difference and the access to privileges and access to a better education
Mhm.
from a very, very young age. I mean, she was a child when she noticed these things. And this brings into question something else too, which feeds into your earlier comment about interventionism and aid, right? When organizations come into a place and clearly work with one community
Mhm.
and not another, and clearly prefer and favor a certain group, that will create consequences that go far, far beyond that moment. So we have to be very, very, very careful when we walk into a different context and space to help or support.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we saw that we talked about in class, in the context of, for example, Algeria. When in the 19th century, French Jewish organizations like the Alliance were advocating for citizenship, for the Jews of Algeria to receive French citizenship. They, in their minds, they were just helping,
Yeah.
their Jewish co-religionists, their Jewish, brethren. They did
Yeah.
not foresee. I don't. I mean, I don't think they. I don't think they didn't push themselves to imagine what the consequences might be. And then 100 years later, these tragic consequences of 100 years of social divisions, and then the nationalist movements in Algeria that then said, okay, well, we're going to make an Algeria for Algerians. And if you have a French passport, you're not Algerian. You can go back to France. And then this rupture,
Yeah.
this tearing of the social fabric, and then you end up with what we have now, which is all of this displacement of Algerian Jews out of Algeria, and this
Yeah.
hole in the Algerian social fabric. There used to be a Jewish community, and now there's not. And the same thing in Morocco, where there's this
Absolutely.
absence, but sort of everyone is to blame and no one is to blame. There's
Yeah.
the
So
circumstances
many things. Yeah.
that you know
Yeah, for so many things, but the result is that you have a lot of broken people on the Muslim side, on the Jewish side, on many sides, right? People with deep, deep existential malaise, who one are prone to radicalism, prone to extremism, prone to hatred, prone to demonization and otherization, and that's a problem.
Yeah. So I want to get back a little bit to feminism, because I just have a few I want to just touch. So, I mean, we could just talk, there are hours and hours we could talk about all these.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm curious, in terms of what are the, avenues to pursue for promoting, and fighting for an equal future. There are social changes that need to be made. Are there legal changes that need to be made? Are there international, restructuring, governmental restructuring? Like, what are the different levels that you're trying to work on? When we think full of
Right. So this brings up a few things. I think one, to continue this theme of decolonizing and looking through your history, I think we have to understand our feminist history in the region, because this is part of the challenge, because feminism is kind of viewed still as a Western construct and a Western import. And the West only makes this worse by intervening on the behalf of oppressed Muslim women, right? Because they give them an excuse to say, yes, exactly. You see these, backwards Arabs or whatever, and the kind of abuses they do to their women, without reflecting on the abuses in the United States of America, for example, because domestic abuse happens in America, because rape happens too often in college campuses in America, because sexual harassment happens in Hollywood. And,
it's not like, it doesn't really matter what you're wearing, right? It's not like, I think there's this idea that, and maybe we'll get to the question of the veil, right? And you talked about, clothing and bodies, right? But I think a lot of people, no matter where they are, want to say, well, if we could just control women's bodies the right way, then that would solve the problem. Like, force them to wear this, or force them to not wear this, or force them to look this way or not look this way. Turns out that that's actually not.
That's not how it works.
And it's not the solution.
Yeah, absolutely. Because this is all still perpetuating the same system. If you're dominating people in order to get a result, you're not solving anything, you're only making matters worse. And we can definitely get into that. And that's when we would step into radical feminism, which is what I subscribe to. Now, to go back to your question of like, what shall we do? Well, we have to learn about our history, about the feminists who were born and grew up in feminist context. I'm sorry, I'm getting a call, so I'm just gonna have to find a way to get rid of it. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, great, amazing. And we have to learn about scholars of Islamic feminism. For example, Fatima Mernissi, who went to Brandeis, whoop, whoop. She basically engineered the school of thought known as Islamic feminism. And really interestingly, so I'm actually doing I'm gonna reveal something. I'm doing a documentary on her. Yeah, and I'll talk to you outside of this classroom about it because I think you would really dig it. But she was able to go back to Islamic jurisdiction and theology and say, well, look, you think that Muslims are oppressive to women? Look at the Prophet. He married a woman who was much older than him, who had more money and power, and she was a boss lady. and so, you know, she uses that as an example. She uses his granddaughter Sukaina as an example of a woman who basically mobilized and militarized entire community, like a tribe of people, and led a battle that is famously known in this region as the Battle of the Camel. And Fatima Nisi says, because they cannot stand to name the battle after a woman, the Battle of Sukaina, because then that creates this dissonance in the minds of men, young men and boys, that, oh, how could a girl ride a camel and go into war, right? And that's what's really interesting, is that we have had this real separation from our history. And if we only take the time to go back and tell the stories of really deep feminist experiences that happened within the context of, and not just Islam, but political Islam, which is a tool used to limit and restrict and control women's bodies, right? I think that becomes really powerful and can create a lot of change and has the possibility to reform a lot in our context, because it's important to speak the language that people connect with. And in a context where most women in this region, because of certain political ideologies, are now hijabis. They wear the veil and they feel strongly about it, and that's their rights, right? And they are spiritual and they connect with God, and so use a language that they can understand and that resonates really well, and that allows them the certain kind of emancipation or liberation that can have a much more positive and sustainable kind of long-term impact, and that they can use with their own daughters and with their boys and with their family members, right? And that you can use in the mosque, given fatwas and khitab for the Jum'ah and all of these things. Language that, and that's the thing, like, we have these spaces already, we have these communities already, we have reception to this kind of language, so why not use that to push for the liberation of all people?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I sign me up. You know, that sounds great. Let me ask you what you mean by radical feminism. You know, what is that to you? How does it play out?
I'm so glad you said that, because I feel like the word radical gets misinterpreted, and so, especially for someone who lives in this region. So radical feminism is basically this idea that if you want to fight any type of sexist oppression and patriarchy, you're going to have to look at all of the other systems of oppression that are modeled. The radical feminists believe that the racial injustice, that all of the isms that plague our society have been modeled around this domination of men over women. That was kind of the earliest form of oppression known to us. And so men did that to sort of attain certain privileges. And in order to do that, they had to make the other group believe that they were less than. And then when they realized that there is a fight over resources, they had to hire slave labor, and so created slavery by making certain people believe that they were less than as well. So radical feminism tells you that in order to fight sexism or fight racism, it has to be an intersectional effort And you have to look into how all of these systems not just are modeled around each other, but connect and feed off each other. And so a radical feminist is someone who fights against all forms of oppression, to put it simply.
If I can then use that to get into a little bit of pragmatics, I would love to hear sort of, okay, how do you then translate those ideas into reality? And specifically, if I can ask about your daily life as an entrepreneurs, a business owner, how do you translate those principles into your work, your life? How does that play out?
Yeah, I would say it's really rough, especially in the business world. And I also make jewelry, which is something that has been known for like oppressing people and obviously, blood diamonds and things like that. So I decided very consciously when I was going into this business that I wanted to do it in a way that's sustainable and ethical, not use diamonds, only use sustainably sourced stones. And I also decided that I only wanted to hire minority women because I relate to them, and because I believe that they don't have access to job opportunities the same way. And for someone who's been in these spaces and doing this work, I know that it's not for lack of capacity. I know it's not for lack of education, not for lack of potential, but because of internal biases that we all have and that we constantly have to kind of uncheck ourselves for and to reflect on, because it's like water. You drink it every day. And so it's very tough to start doing that work. And this brings up some issues that are happening in the US where people say, well, I'm not racist. I have Black friends. I'm not racist. I deal with people the same way. But it's not about that. It's about how does your racial bias show up every single day, and how does it prevent other people from access to certain privileges and certain jobs and certain opportunities, and what can you do to, instead of saying I'm not racist, extend those privileges? That's what's really important to me. And so if you can't say I'm not racist if you're not doing that work. I think that should be really important to know. But and so those are some of the ways I do this, but also in terms of the company making kind of luxury goods and requiring models and things like that. I try as much as possible to be inclusive, even with the marketing, even with how the jewelry shows up on women's bodies, and not to be, not to use it as a way to perpetuate the kind of objectifying male gaze, but rather to do it in ways that are multi-layered and that are not damaging to women. And this is such a struggle because we build businesses and marketing off of the bodies of women. So this is something I struggle with every single day. Wow. Yeah, there's so much. Now I'm gonna cry.
I think it's very powerful, and something that's always struck me when I look at the kinds of material that you've produced, both in terms of your own art, and in terms of thinking about the photographs for your jewelry, the models, the business marketing material. What has always struck me about it is the power that it has to create a vision of the world we want to live in. You're showing it to us in these images, right? You're staging, curating a vision that you say, look, here is the world I would like to live in, and I'm working to make it possible. And the images are so inviting that it encourages us, the viewers and clients, to say, yeah, I want to sign on to, I want to be a part of that. I want to be in that picture, right? I want to be a part of that vision.
Yeah.
So, I think there is, as hard as I'm sure it must be, incredible challenges. I think there's also, it has so much power in it, on the other end, to receive those images and say, wow, I really am inspired to join, the work for making that reflect, what I see around me. I don't want it to just be in this picture. I want it to
Yeah.
look around and see that. I want to see, this diversity of bodies, this diversity of identities.
Yeah.
I want to see that, and the picture helps me remember that. So I think there's a huge responsibility
Yeah.
that you're.
I really hope so, and I hope it also inspires policy. Like when you talk about
Yeah.
sustainability and those kind of ethical practices, I hope that it can inspire more policy in that direction for not just the jewelry industry but others. And I hope that the when we talk about our aims for a more inclusive society through the business and through what we stage,
Hmm.
even aesthetically and visually, I hope that it can also inspire politicians to do that work. So we'll see.
Oh yeah, inshallah, as they say. Let me,
Exactly. That means it'll never happen.
yeah, the good kind of inshallah. Let me end by asking you, just, I don't want to take up too much of your evening. Um, Let me conclude by asking you what brings you hope for continuing the work.
I'm eternally a hopeful person. And I think it's the possibility of like envisioning this future that you talked about. And it's the stories that I grew up with, it's the stories of hope that I heard through my father growing up in a very kind of multicultural environment, even though it was marked by trauma. I'm not gonna lie, state-sponsored trauma and personal trauma and things that I am working through, like literally within my body, and that have showed up for me very personally. But at the same time, when I look to those stories, not just from my father's storytelling, but also stories of coexistence through Andalusia, for example, which is why I built the business, and through different Muslim empires who would not be where they are without the relationship they've had with the Jews, for example. And through my research before I built the business, it became really clear to me that these strong Muslim empires only grew and attained certain kinds of power because of being intentionally inclusive with minorities. And the second they started to oppress minorities, the second they started to collapse. And we could see this showing up with the US very recently, right?
Yeah.
Where it was heavily diminished globally, not taken seriously. And you could also see that it's just not the same center of innovation and research and policy and influence that it used to be. And so when I look to these stories, and I look to stories of very strong women that were born out of these multicultural societies within different Muslim empires, I am so inspired. And I think it's possible. It's just that we don't talk about it. It's just that we haven't seen it. It's just that little girls and little Black girls have not heard these things. So what can we do to bring them back and to make people believe that it's within them, that they too are capable, that they can transcend, that they can not just liberate themselves, but others, and do it in ways that are meaningful and do it in ways that are not damaging. And I think this is what's really crucial.
Wow. Well, that is a real message. I think that speaks to all of us, even here in the United States, all around the world.
Yeah.
It's as true for us as it is for you. So thank you so much for sharing it and sharing your time.
Thank you for having me so much. And I really appreciate these kind of conversations, and I hope your students will get something out of it. I remain available if anyone wants to email me or wants to have another discussion. I would be very, very happy to do that.
Wonderful. All right.